Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Catherine Cosin, and I'm the Volunteer and Membership Program Manager for Chevy Chase at Home. For those who might not be familiar with us, Chevy Chase at Home is part of the nationwide village movement in which neighbors get together to help seniors in their area age in place. So Chevy Chase at Home helps seniors in the Chevy Chase area with volunteer services like rides to medical appointments, tech support, help changing light bulbs, or other friendly visits and so forth. We also provide social and educational programming, including some public programs open to the wider public like this one. So to learn more about us and our other upcoming programs, please check out www.chevychaseathome.org. I'm delighted to introduce author and historian and former speechwriter Jeff Shesol, who will be speaking today about his book, Mercury Rising, John Glenn, John Kennedy, and the New Battleground of the Cold War, which came out last June. A founding partner of West Wing Writers, Shesol is the author of Supreme Power, Franklin Roosevelt versus the Supreme Court, which was selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year in 2010, and a favorite book of the year by The New Yorker. Shesol's previous book, Mutual Contempt, Lyndon Johnson, Robert Kennedy, and the Feud That Defined a Decade, was also a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. In 1997, President Bill Clinton read Mutual Contempt and invited Shesol to become one of his speechwriters. During his 3 years at the White House, Shesol became the deputy chief speechwriter and a member of the senior staff. He played a leading role in drafting 2 of State of the Union addresses, the President's 2000 Democratic National Convention speech and the farewell address, among hundreds of other speeches. He covered a range of issues from economic policy to international development, technological innovation, and the arts. He also helped lead the president's team of humor writers. A Rhodes Scholar, Jeff received his master's in history from Oxford University in 1993 and graduated from Brown University with highest honors in 1991. His comic strip Thatch was nationally syndicated from 1994 to 1998, when it appeared daily in more than 150 newspapers. He has taught presidential history at Princeton University, where he was the Anschutz Distinguished Fellow in American Studies, and the University of California, Washington Center. Shesol publishes widely under his own byline and provides frequent commentary on TV and radio. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Rebecca, a civil rights attorney, and their 2 children. Now, Jeff has asked that questions be held until the Q&A at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit your questions to the Zoom chat at any time so you don't forget them. And if you're not familiar, the chat is the center button in your bottom menu. That's how you can access it to ask questions. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Jeff. And again, as a reminder, please make sure that unless you are asking a question at the end verbally, that you keep yourself muted to keep any distracting noises out. So thank you again for coming today, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I want to thank you for the introduction, and I especially want to thank Susan Post for the invitation to come join all of you. Susan, who's a dear friend of my in-laws, Stephen and B. Epstein, who may in fact be joining us here today as well, even though they've heard all this before. So I'll try to vary my presentation just a little bit. But thank you to all of you for joining me in the middle of a day, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in later on YouTube. I want to talk to you, as Catherine mentioned, about my new book, Mercury Rising, which is about the space race as a Cold War contest. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. And I will share some slides in a minute to make this just a little bit more visual than looking at my face for the next hour. As Catherine said, I'll be very happy to take questions. I'll talk for a little while, and then I'll open it up to any questions that you might have. But first, I want to share a little bit about why I decided to write this book. On the one hand, it might seems self-evident. It's an incredibly exciting story. All of you who lived through that period of time, and those of us who didn't, all can see just how exciting the early space race was, and how tense it was, and what heroes it produced. John Glenn really first among them, and maybe foremost among them. And so it's the sort of story that I think a lot of us who write narrative history are eager to tell, and yet it's been told many times. And I wanted to be sure that there was a reason to tell it again, that there was another way to look at the story. And for me, what drew me into this were some questions that I felt hadn't really been answered by all the reading that I'd done about it, whether it was reading about John Glenn as an individual or reading about the period of time. And that is to truly understand why this flight, this orbital flight of John Glenn's, the flight of Friendship 7 in February 1962, why it mattered so much. It seems, again, obvious to anyone who lived through the period, or any of us who have read the histories, that this was one of the big ones. This was one of the big flights during the space race. And why was that? Yes, Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. We know that alone would put John Glenn in the history books, even if he hadn't done anything else. And he did do many other things. And yet, by the time Glenn orbited the Earth, 2 Russians had already done that. And by the time Glenn got in the capsule and went into space, 2 Americans had already been into space before him. They hadn't orbited the Earth. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But he wasn't the first American in space. He wasn't the first person to orbit the Earth. So what was it about this flight and about this particular astronaut that at the beginning of March in 1962, shortly after the flight, 4 million people came out in the streets of New York, the biggest demonstration since the end of World War II. 4 million people in the freezing cold, climbing up onto bridges, sitting on window ledges, just to get a glimpse of John Glenn's motorcade. What was it about this flight that unleashed that kind of demonstration that really wasn't seen for any of the other flights during that period, with the exception of Apollo 11, for reasons that are probably pretty straightforward? What was it about this moment? That was the question that I really wanted to understand. And as I dug into it, to see whether there was a story there, it became clear to me that the bookshelf is essentially divided on this story. You have the space books on one shelf, and in my case, literally, I've got a shelf full of space books, as you would expect. And they sort of acknowledged that there was a Cold War on. It didn't escape anybody's notice that we were racing against the Soviet Union, but they're not really focused on the Cold War. They're really focused on the rockets and the people who flew on them. And then there's another bookshelf, and that's the literature about the Kennedy era, about the Cold War, about Khrushchev. And those books will acknowledge that the space race was part of all this, but they're really not that interested in the space race. They're more interested in Berlin. They're more interested in Cuba, in Southeast Asia, because these are the hot spots, or they were the potential hot spots of the Cold War. And space seems to be kind of a sideshow. But what I came to understand, and this is really the story that I tell in this book, is that as they were understood, as they were experienced at the time, these were all part of the same struggle. And America's inability, and that's really the word that I would use, America's inability to get a person into orbit before John Glenn in February of 62 was seen to be a national security risk of potentially calamitous stakes. That if the Soviet Union, as John Kennedy said when he ran for president in 1960, if the Soviet Union dominates space, they will dominate life here on Earth. Those were the stakes as they were understood. And we have, over the years since, we've separated out these storylines. And by disentangling them when they were very much entangled in the moment, we were missing key components of both. And so what I really tried to do in this book is to restore these two stories to the same frame, and to understand that John Glenn, yes, was an astronaut, but he was also a cold warrior in a profound way. And that space was understood by President Kennedy and all of those around him to be a battleground in the Cold War, and one where the United States had to make a show of strength if it was not to lose out in a dangerous way to the Soviet Union, not just for the sake of prestige, but again, for the sake of our national security. that I felt was a story that needed telling, and that's the one that I've tried to tell in Mercury Rising. So with that, let me share my screen and share some of these images for you. And that should do it. Are you all seeing the screen there now? It's telling me you are. Okay, great. Terrific. Well, this is, I think, a familiar face for all of you. And this is John Glenn getting ready to make that historic flight into space. But let's begin at the beginning of the space race, which of course was Sputnik in October of 1957. This is a press conference that President Eisenhower held just a few days after Sputnik had gone up. And his body language really tells you everything that you need to know about Eisenhower's perspective on all of this. He really ultimately did not see that it was such a big deal. It was just, as he said at this press conference, a small ball in the air, that the Soviets had just put a small ball in the air, and that was all it had done. And this was the line that his administration took. And one after another, they kind of lined up to denigrate the Soviet achievement as not a very big deal. And yet, if it wasn't such a big deal, why hadn't the United States been able to do it ourselves? In fact, we had failed to do it to that point. And Eisenhower is expressing in this pose his impatience with that question, because ultimately Eisenhower didn't really see space as all that important. It was important to him in one regard, which was that it was a place where we could send surveillance satellites and keep an eye on the Soviet Union to make sure that it wasn't going to launch a surprise nuclear attack. But other than that, he tended to consider space to be kind of science fiction comic book stuff. And it was sort of silly and a huge waste of time and money. And there's a long list, and I quote a few of them in the book, but there's a long list of denigrating remarks that Eisenhower made about the whole thing. Among them, the idea that we don't have any enemies on the moon, so why bother with the moon? And this was very much his position. But as it was emerging, the country and the rest of the world actually disagreed and thought that Sputnik was a huge deal, particularly because Sputnik was followed in short sequence by a whole series of firsts. It wasn't just a one-shot deal by the Soviet Union, as I'm sure you know. It was followed by Sputnik 2 a month later, in which they sent Laika, the dog, into orbit around the Earth. Another huge step forward. They sent a spacecraft to crash land onto the moon. They couldn't quite soft land it yet, but the fact that it got to the moon was also a huge deal. The Soviets sent a spacecraft around to the far side of the moon and photographed it. This had never been done. It had never been seen before. It was one thing after another, and the United States was caught on the defensive without a program that was really doing much of anything. NASA didn't exist yet. There was sort of a space program, but it was actually multiple space programs. It was fragmented among the different military branches. The Air Force had its own space program for its own purposes. The Navy had a rival space program, and so on. The Army even had a space program. It's hard to understand exactly what the Army thought it was going to be doing in space, as opposed to maybe the Air Force. But nonetheless, nobody wanted to lose out in this internecine battle among the military branches. And so as pressure began to build on Eisenhower, pressure generated in part by this man, future president, I'm sure you recognize, Lyndon Johnson, it became untenable for Eisenhower to hold that position for much longer. And Johnson led hearings at the end of 1957, beginning of 1958, to put a lot of heat on the administration to do something to catch up to the Soviets, who were already far, far ahead in this race, and to begin to make the case of why the race mattered. And it was Johnson, again, who said that this was a national security concern, and he wasn't alone. He lined up a whole series at these hearings of generals and admirals and other defense experts, veterans of the Manhattan Project, who one after another said that the Soviet game was ultimately to build a nuclear base on the moon that would lie outside the range of US defenses, or to build a nuclear space station that would just sit in orbit above the United States, ready to drop nuclear bombs on the US at the slightest provocation. These were considered to be extremely viable ideas. The Soviets, as I said, were succeeding in doing pretty much everything that they seemed to want to do in space. And if the United States couldn't establish a presence, couldn't establish a program, then the consequences could be pretty existential. So by the middle of 1958, Eisenhower finally agreed to create a civilian space agency to take over what these feuding military branches were sort of messing up by their overlaps and their misdirection and their competition, and to take over the manned space program, which became Project Mercury. It was only, of course, one element of the space program, but that was the one that got the most press. It was also the one, we'll introduce our protagonist here. It was also the one who interested this man. Not at this age. This is John Glenn in New Concord, Ohio, his little hometown in southeastern Ohio, at the age of 17. Already absolutely fascinated by flight. Not sure how he was going to get to do it, but he found a way. On the eve of World War I, the government decided to launch a civilian pilot training program because it could see that war was very likely coming and they would need a cadre of trained pilots. And so Glenn was able to sign up finally for the flight lessons that he had coveted since he was a little kid. Growing up in this little town, a town of 1,000 people, a town that was a mile across, and got some training. And after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted. Although he didn't actually get to see action until toward the end of the war, he did fight in the Pacific Theater, in the South Pacific. He fought with distinction. He won a number of honors. He flew test runs with Charles Lindbergh, of all people, who was sent out to conduct some bombing runs with the Marine pilots, and John Glenn was one. And the war was so thrilling for John Glenn. There was a huge difference, as I'm sure you can understand, between being a Marine pilot in the air and being the Marines on the ground and in the water of the South Pacific. So as unfortunate as it might be to put it this way, John Glenn had a really wonderful war. And when he came back, he just wanted to get back into combat just as soon as there was a reason to do so. And he did in Korea. And this is a John Glenn that we encounter in Korea. And I describe this again in the book, that I think most people don't know. Those of us who are familiar with John Glenn, either as a senator or John Glenn during the space program, when he was a warm, very low-key, kind of all-American presence. The John Glenn was a ferocious fighter pilot. He was known as that among all of the other ferocious fighter pilots. He really distinguished himself in his ability not only to lead, but also to lead pilots into dangerous situations and somehow get them out of there. Always looking out for others' welfare, but always willing to put his own welfare at risk. He got a reputation in Korea for drawing more enemy fire than anybody else and coming back to base in these hopelessly damaged planes that somehow he managed to get back to base in South Korea. Here's one of them. This is a typical John Glenn story from Korea, where he was heading toward an enemy target with his commanding officer, and his commanding officer said, "This is too dangerous. We're drawing too much hostile fire. We have to get out of here." And commanding officer turned around. Well, Glenn turned around and then looped back to go take another strike at the target, which was not what you were supposed to do when your commanding officer said otherwise. And as he headed toward this target, they blew this hole through the tail of his jet. And he's holding up that flight helmet because he wants history to understand just how big that hole is. It is the size of his helmet. And as you can see, that's not the only damage that was done to this plane. He managed to get it back to base. And it's for these reasons that his wingman at the time, a guy named Ted Williams, who you might remember as a baseball player rather than as a fighter pilot, but he was John Glenn's wingman in Korea. And Ted Williams said, "The man is crazy. The man is crazy." And again, you don't see the crazy when you see interviews of John Glenn in 61, 62, or in all those years later that he served in the Senate. But this right here, what you're looking at right here, that's a little bit of the crazy right there. In the years after the war, he became a test pilot. Here he is in a project that he devised himself called Project Bullet, which was a test of the Crusader jet to see if it could set a speed record flying at a supersonic speed across the United States. He did it. He set that record. This is in July of 1957. And this is when John Glenn became known to the public. This picture and a couple of others like it wound up on the front page of every paper in the United States. He was an instant celebrity. And it was because of this that he got invited, as some of you may know, he got invited to appear on Name That Tune, which he did for 5 weeks running, along with a little boy named Eddie Hodges. And they racked up win after win. They charmed the country. And John Glenn was really seen as a kind of classic American type coming from a small town, but leading America into this technologically very exciting future. He saw himself that way. And so he was a natural to apply for Project Mercury, and was lucky to be selected, not just lucky, but he was appropriately selected as one of the first 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7. They were selected in early 1959, and here they are being introduced to the public at a press conference at NASA headquarters. And forgive the blurriness of this photo. This is from YouTube, and I would recommend that any of you who are interested in this, take a look at this press conference on YouTube, because it is John Glenn really at his best. I mean, you can see the body language here. He is absolutely as comfortable as anybody could possibly be in front of the cameras. He's telling jokes, he's delivering homespun speeches about his family and his faith completely earnestly. It was an extraordinary performance, and not one that any of these other pilots, as great as they were as pilots, was going to be able to manage. And there was a lot of resentment of John Glenn's celebrity. He came in the door as a celebrity, and he emerged from this press conference being the astronaut of all of the 7 that the press would be most interested in and really, frankly, in love with. They adored John Glenn, and they gave him very favorable, preferable treatment among the others. And it was really a source of resentment among these 7 who were sort of teammates, but also really rivals, because what they really wanted was to be the first in space. Now, shifting theater for a moment here, back to the political sphere. In 1960, when John Kennedy ran for president, it was well understood by the public, not just here in the United States, but across the free world, that the United States was far behind and dangerously behind in the space race. In fact, there were some polls that were taken by Gallup internationally at that time that indicated they identified something that the political scientists called satellite pessimism. And this is what that meant. They polled people in our allied countries, in West Germany, in France, in Britain, and they asked people there which of the 2 superpowers would be ahead militarily in a decade's time. And by a 2-to-1 margin, our own allies said that the Soviet Union would be ahead, by 2-to-1 margin. And what the polls revealed was that this had less to do with the number of ICBMs that the 2 countries had. In fact, the United States was really dominating in that regard. But it was about space. It was about the capabilities that the Soviets had showed again and again and again on this new technological frontier. And whatever the realities of war making in space might or might not be, that kind of proficiency was absolutely terrifying in the United States and for our allies as well. And so Kennedy ran on a platform of not only catching up, but leapfrogging the Soviets in space. It wasn't the centerpiece of his campaign, but it was certainly something that he repeated again and again in 1960, because he understood that this really was a symbol for him of the ways in which the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, since his opponent, of course, was Nixon in 1960, how the Eisenhower-Nixon administration had really just failed to meet the tests of the atomic age. And so Kennedy said in campaign speech after speech that it was unacceptable for the United States to be second in space. That to be second in space was to be second in the eyes of the world in science and technology, and in military power, and in the larger existential struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. So if space was a symbol to John Kennedy, it was a very powerful symbol. The problem was that he didn't have a plan to catch up. He alerted the country to the need to catch up, which was already on the minds of many, but he didn't really have a plan to do it. And so when he took office at the beginning of 1961, And he confronted a whole host of problems around the world, from a civil war in Laos that threatened to draw the United States in, to nuclear brinksmanship in Berlin, to the problem of Cuba right on our doorstep, and so on, to the growing civil rights revolution here in the United States and the danger of mob violence in the South. Kennedy looked at all of this, and suddenly space didn't seem that important. Space sort of fell down his list of immediate priorities. And it was on the list, but it was something that he was going to get to later. And this was the case for the first few months of his administration. But on April 12th, 1961, so exactly 61 years ago today, 61 years ago, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth, to go into space at all. They didn't just go into space, but he orbited the Earth once before returning safely to Earth. And even though the United States and the CIA, federal government, had expected this, there was still a hope that we were going to somehow beat them to the punch. And the failure to do that delivered another shockwave, really, in public opinion and globally, in the way that Sputnik did. And Kennedy suddenly recognized that he couldn't delay any longer. And he needed to figure out what his plan was going to be and how we were possibly going to catch up to the Soviet Union. It was in that moment that he agreed to finally allow the first American to go into space. That wound up not being John Glenn, despite everybody's expectations. That wound up being Alan Shepard, who is pictured here at the White House, receiving a medal from President Kennedy. There's John Glenn in the center, maybe expressing just a little bit of his frustration that he didn't get to be first. It was a very powerful frustration. I write a lot about this rivalry in the book, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. But Shepard's flight was not the equal of Yuri Gagarin's flight. Gagarin, as I said, orbited the Earth. We didn't yet have a rocket that was powerful enough to do that, or we did, but it hadn't been tested sufficiently, and it was not safe to put a human being on it. So we had to use a less powerful rocket, the Redstone, and all we could manage at that point was a suborbital flight, 15 minutes from start to finish, up, down. That was it. You shoot it up, it goes just barely into space, and then gravity pulls them back down. This is exactly what you've seen Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin doing. These are suborbital flights. And that was the best we could do. So while Shepard's achievement was celebrated and the United States finally had gotten into space, we were still very, very far behind. And the teams at NASA, the engineers and others, were working to get that more powerful rocket, which was called the Atlas rocket, to get it what they called man-rated, since of course they were not at that time going to put a woman on top of a rocket. They had to man-rate it. They had to make it safe for a man to sit on top of it. But here we are in the middle of 1961. The Soviets have already gotten into space. And the Atlas is plagued by all of these problems. These are some of the so-called problem areas that NASA identified. And as you can see, this is pretty much everything that you need to go right in order for a rocket to fly. And at one point or another, every one of these things was going wrong. And so we had to go forward with a second suborbital flight. That was Gus Grissom in the summer of 1961, and had to wait for that orbital flight. Then the Soviets did it again with an even more spectacular flight in August of 1961. And then, as if to emphasize the point, within 2 weeks of sending Gurman Titov around the Earth 17 and a half times, they began to resume nuclear testing, atmospheric nuclear testing, for the first time since 1958, exploding more powerful nuclear weapons than the world had ever seen. And again, the separate storylines on the bookshelf did not seem to be separate storylines at the time. And when you read the newspaper reporting of the period, these two things, what Titov had been able to do in orbit and what the Soviets were doing with nuclear weapons over the skies of Central Asia, were absolutely related and manifestations of the same technological power and the same new determination to use that power. So we had to get the Atlas man-rated. And that was happening over the summer of 1961. And in the early fall, John Glenn finally got what he had been waiting for, which was the selection to fly. And all of the indignity of not getting to go first and not getting to go second was washed away by the fact that he would get to fly the first orbital flight. And that was a huge difference, again, between a suborbital flight and an orbital flight. And it was an orbital flight that would finally put us into an active competition with the Soviet Union. But he had to fly on top of this rocket. And while Glenn maintained a picture of perfect calm publicly and perfect confidence in NASA, as the summer turned into the fall and the fall went into the winter of 1961, and the flight was delayed again and again and again because of technical problems. This was a flight that was delayed, that was scrubbed 10 times over the course of 4 months, 10 times. And there's a building sense of anxiety in the country that it's never going to happen, or if it does, it's going to be a total disaster. I mean, why should NASA have to scrub the flight 10 times? Nothing like that had happened with the two previous flights. Maybe they had been scrubbed once, maybe twice, but 10 times suggested that something was really going wrong or was going to go wrong with the Atlas rocket. And again, while Glenn maintained that picture of calm, privately, he was beginning to have his own doubts and beginning to wonder whether he was going to be the first person to die in space. And this was something of a revelation to me, because there was no hint of any of this, as I said publicly, and there's been no hint of this in the written record. But I found some really fascinating documents at the Glenn Archives at Ohio State that give you a window into Glenn's mindset at this time when he's preparing to be the first human being, as opposed to chimpanzee, that's strapped on the top of that rocket there and sent into space. Firstly, he was in a constant struggle with his NASA managers and the engineers, who really wanted him to fly the whole thing on autopilot, as they had designed it to do, not to take any unnecessary risks, and essentially just to kind of go along for the ride and troubleshoot and report back. Well, Glenn, like the others, was a pilot. He was selected because he was one of the greatest pilots that the country had seen, and he had confidence in his ability to fly this thing. But they were holding him back, and they were also changing the flight plan constantly in ways that he found to be dangerous, and doing so without his input. There was a real struggle for control between the astronauts and the managers from the beginning of the program, and it really reaches its peak with Glenn. Here's a note card that I found as Glenn was preparing for another contentious meeting with the flight managers. And what he's saying here, if you can read his handwriting, is all in the interest of flight safety at the top. Not true, he says. No one is better able to judge that than I am. And yet they are making these decisions for him. They're not asking his opinion about what's in the interest of flight safety. And so as Glenn goes one more time into isolation, as he's preparing for what he hopes will actually be the actual flight and not just one more failed attempt, he sits down to write something for his family. This was, I think, the most surprising and really chilling document that I found at the Glenn Archives. And it's a big stack of about 16 pages of yellow legal paper. And this is the first one. I didn't know what I was looking at when I started to read it, but you can see at the top, he says, "If you hear this, I've been killed." And it became clear to me as I read on and I connected it to some other clues that I had run across, that what this was a script for a recording that Glenn made for his children, who were teenagers at the time, Lynn and David. And he made another recording like this for his wife that would be played only in the event that he didn't come back alive. And it is a really, as I said, it's chilling. It's very moving. He reflects on his religious faith and his belief in the afterlife. Glenn was a very religious person, and he's instructing his children how he wants them to conduct themselves at his funeral at Arlington, where there probably wouldn't even be a body to bury if he was lost in space, or if the rocket exploded. I mean, this is the nature of this script. And one of the last things that Glenn says to his wife, Annie, when he is finally strapped into that capsule and it is finally about to lift off, is he said, "Did you get the recordings that I sent you?" And she said yes. She hadn't listened to them, but these were the recordings that he was referring to. But as I said, after 10 postponements, he finally did get to fly this thing as he had wanted all along. Here he is the morning of, slipping into or really being pushed into Friendship 7, the capsule. It's about the size in there of a cockpit of a small fighter jet. And as Glenn said, you don't get in it, you put it on like a piece of clothing. And on February 20th, 1962, at 9:47 in the morning, the rocket lifted off. It was perfect liftoff. There were no troubles at all. But of course, the public, after all of these months of delay, was really pretty terrified. There was not a lot of jubilation when it finally lifted off. There was still a lot of terror here in the United States that Glenn wouldn't come back safely. And essentially, the country stopped in its tracks for the next 5 hours, including this man. Here is Kennedy with Johnson and Hubert Humphrey watching the liftoff on a little TV in the state dining room at the White House. Kennedy was unable to focus on anything for the next 5 hours except what was going on in space. And here is Glenn himself in space, who on that first orbit, he was slated for 3 orbits, was really having a wonderful, wonderful time. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. He was able to control the capsule. He was seeing what he wanted to see. He was taking pictures with the camera that he brought, which was something that he had to get special permission to do. But at the end of the first orbit, 2 things either went wrong or seemed to go wrong. One was that the autopilot began to act up, and the capsule started to act almost like a car with its wheels out of alignment that's starting to kind of skate on the road. And Glenn had to keep correcting this himself and burning fuel to do it. And ultimately, he just switched to manual control, which was fine with him. As I said before, they really just wanted to fly this thing. They weren't interested in the autopilot any more than they had to be. But then something else was going on that Glenn wasn't aware of, but at Mission Control at Cape Canaveral, they were aware. And that was that a warning light had gone on one of the consoles that suggested that the heat shield had started to separate from the rest of the capsule, which was something that was supposed to happen just before splashdown to cushion the blow as it hit the water. But it was certainly not supposed to happen in space, because if the heat shield was separated at all from the capsule, then he would not have the protection that he needed against the heat of reentry, and he would be incinerated on the way back through the atmosphere. And this is a NASA drawing of what was supposed to happen ultimately. And you can see when the parachute is fully out, you can see how the heat shield is sort of dropped down, and there's a little accordion bag. It was called a landing bag that was supposed to be that cushion. But again, if that was exposed in space, then it was going to be game over for John Glenn. And the last 2 orbits were a time of total panic in Mission Control as they debated whether the signal was correct, and if the signal was correct, whether anything could be done to save John Glenn from the inferno of coming back through the atmosphere. I will leave that drama to the book or for the Q&A if you'd like to hear more about it, in part because you know the outcome. You, of course, know that John Glenn did return safely to Earth. But the story of what they thought at Mission Control and how they plan to deal with it, I think, is a really fascinating and important one, certainly a lesson in crisis management. Here he is a few days later at Cape Canaveral, President Kennedy coming to celebrate, do literally a victory lap in the presidential limousine around the complex there, and to give Glenn a medal. And you, of course, also know that Glenn had a long career after that trip to space in the United States Senate, serving 4 terms from the state of Ohio. Here he is with another politician of his era and our own. And you probably also remember that Glenn went back into space at the age of 77 in 1998 on the space shuttle. He got to stay a lot longer on that trip than the 5 hours that he spent on Friendship 7. With that, I'll close this piece of the presentation. This is an image of the book, and this is where you can find a little bit more information about it on my website and on Twitter, if you're on Twitter. And with that, I will stop sharing, and I will be happy to take any questions that you might have.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and your You've got a great way of speaking. Loved all the images. Now, we do have one question so far asking, what does sitting on top of the rocket mean? Bringing to mind Dr. Strangelove.
Yes, that's quite an image. Literally riding a rocket, like riding a bull at a rodeo or something, like Dr. Strangelove did. Let me actually go back and bring up the photo, because I can explain this a little bit better by looking at it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again here, and we're just going to run our way up to that picture of the Atlas. Now, if you take a look at the image on the left, at the very top there, you can see a couple things. There's looks like a little ladder at the very top. That's an escape rocket that would pull the capsule to safety, if possible. And just below that, where it says 6 feet 10 inches, that's the capsule. That's the capsule that you saw John Glenn climbing in. And everything else below that is this rocket, which is a very thin-skinned steel structure that was so thin-skinned that it would, if it wasn't fully pressurized, it would just collapse like a balloon. It was essentially inflated with both pressure and fuel. So he's sitting on top of this, literally. And the way that he would sit in the capsule was with his back against the rocket. So you can imagine him essentially lying on his back here with his feet kind of sticking up toward the narrow end of the capsule. So he was quite literally sitting on top of this capsule, and it was quite an experience, as you can remember, as you can imagine, hearing the sounds that were coming of something this big, this powerful, and this explosive.
All right. Well, we do have a request to finish the story of the heat shield. Though I don't know if does anyone else have a quicker question first before we get to that one? Oh, all right. Well, let's. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to, Jeff, could you speak a little bit about the rivalry between Johnson and Kennedy during this period? Because, I know that's a really interesting part of the story for you.
Thank you, Steve. These are my in-laws. As I mentioned, they were going to join us. And that question, I just want everybody to know, is not a plant. We did not discuss this beforehand. But I'm happy to address that. What's interesting about Lyndon Johnson really is in my view, the unsung hero of the space program. You saw him right there on that Life magazine cover, leading the charge. Within 24 hours of Sputnik, Johnson was out there talking about it and demanding that the federal government respond to it in some way. Certainly, he saw political opportunity in that, but he also saw the national security challenge. He led the charge in a way that John Kennedy didn't during those years that they spent in the Senate together. Kennedy really wasn't interested in space, ironically, since he's the one who pointed us to the moon in 1961. He was really late to the discussion. It was really only in 1960, when Kennedy was running for president, that he began to talk about space. And he was really picking up Lyndon Johnson's talking points. And of course, in 1960, then Kennedy picks Johnson as his running mate. And so when Kennedy becomes president, it's natural that he should turn to Johnson and say, you figure out what we need to do in space. And that was, in fact, what he did. And so Johnson was really taking the leading role within the White House in thinking about the policy, but he couldn't get the president to pay attention at this point. It was Johnson who was taking the lead role in staffing up NASA and considering the changes that needed to be made. And yet, when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, as I said, 61 years ago today, suddenly this was a crisis that demanded the attention of the president. And Kennedy really finally had to engage. Now, again, he turned to Johnson and he said, tell me what I need to do. And Johnson already had an answer, which was that we need to go to the moon, that we were not going to catch up to the Soviets anytime soon, that the only way really to win the space race was to pick a goal that was literally quite far away, and also far away in terms of time, and hope that over the course of a decade, that our superior investments, since the United States certainly could commit more money to the task, and our superior science and technology would get us there before the Soviets. It wasn't a guarantee, but the hope was that we could leapfrog them by 1970. And so Kennedy announced that goal. But as soon as he had done it, really Johnson's work was essentially done. The United States knew what its goal was. The program was up and running. NASA was staffed. And as ironically, as NASA and the space program became more and more important to Kennedy, there was less and less for Lyndon Johnson to do. And when he became president in November of 1963, he really was just seeing through the plans that had been put in place during the Kennedy administration. There weren't the same sort of big decisions to be made by the president during the Johnson years as there were during Kennedy's period of time. So by the time we get to the moon and Nixon is president, Johnson's role in all of this is kind of obscured, because Kennedy is the one who announced that goal to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And then we did. So we were fulfilling Kennedy's pledge while Nixon was president, and Johnson kind of gets lost in the shuffle, which is really a shame, because he really did more than any American, not just any American president, but really any American leader to get us to the moon.
Wow, that is very interesting. So I guess I don't see any other questions at the moment. So if you could finish the story of the heat shield, that would be great.
You bet. You bet. So, one of the many interesting aspects of this is that Chris Kraft, who was the flight director, he ran mission control. And so his word was final on just about every question. When the warning light went on indicating that there was this problem with the heat shield, Kraft said, "Don't tell Glenn." He had this idea that Glenn could only panic if he heard the news. And which is ironic, because these pilots were picked because they were exactly the kind of people who didn't panic. I mean, you saw the hole in the tail of that jet, and John Glenn didn't panic in that case. He got that plane all the way back to the base in South Korea. There's another story I tell in the book about Glenn trying to save a pilot who went down, and failing in that. He allowed his own fuel to run out because that would give him more time to search for his fallen comrade. And so he glided with the last little bit, and this is a plan of John Glenn's. With the last little bit of fuel that he had, he rocketed to a height in that jet of 40,000 feet. And then, as he expected, the fuel cut out, the power went out, and he glided that plane across the length of the entirety of North Korea to get safely back to base in South Korea. And if he calculated wrong, then he was going down behind enemy lines, and it was going to be trouble. But he calculated right. And as the window in the cockpit, the windshield frosted over because there was, again, no power. And all he could see was, what this tiny little blurry spot would allow him to see. Again, John Glenn didn't panic. So Kraft was wildly wrong in thinking that Glenn couldn't be part of any discussion or any solution, but he was kept out of the debate. And instead, when they needed information from him, Mission Control, Mercury Control would ask him these very roundabout, indirect questions, such as, and this is verbatim, "John, do you hear any banging noises?" I mean, imagine this, he's first American to orbit the Earth. He's more than 100 miles above the surface of the Earth. He's going 17,500 miles a minute. And he is being asked if he hears any banging sounds, like he's driving an old car or something like that. And they don't tell him why they're asking. He says, "No, I'm not hearing any banging noise." And they say, okay. And then they come back and they ask another one of these kinds of questions 20 minutes later. And so Glenn starts to put this together. These aren't the usual questions he should be asked, and that something's going on, but they won't tell him what it is. And meanwhile, they're having that fierce debate that I described in the control center about what to do. Half of them feel like this can't possibly be correct. The signal can't be correct. We should just ignore it. Don't cause any problems by trying to do something about nothing. The other half said, "How do we know that? How do we know that the signal is wrong? How can we trust that? We need to come up with something." And ultimately they won the day, but only literally in the last minute before Glenn is brought back to Earth. And the solution that they come up with, if it was a solution at all, is to and again, maybe I'll just bring up this image again because it's easier to explain if I can show you. Now, if you look at in the upper left, you see the sort of rocket blast coming out of that little unit at the bottom of the capsule. That's called the retro pack. They were jets that were strapped on. If you look closely, you can see 3 straps holding that thing on to the heat shield. Those were titanium straps holding it on there. And then if you look at just to the right, you can see that thing is flying off. It looks like a little octopus or something that's just being dropped off. That was supposed to drop off before it comes through the atmosphere so that the heat shield can do what it's supposed to do, which is to take the brunt of the heat. And so some of the engineers said, what if we leave that thing attached? Maybe those straps will hold the heat shield on to the rest of the capsule and prevent it from coming loose. And there's a debate about that because that thing was not built to withstand the heat of reentry. They knew it was going to burn up as it came through. It was going to melt. And it was not made of titanium like the rest of the capsule. And so what would that do? Would these big burning chunks blow a hole in the capsule? And would that be the thing that killed John Glenn? Would leaving it on create aerodynamic problems that caused the capsule to spin out of control and burn up? There were all these unforeseen possibilities. But ultimately, again, as I said, at the very last minute, they made the decision to leave it attached. And so they tell Glenn, leave it attached. And these are his words, and they're in the transcript. And it's kind of incredible. I mean, I think it's quite incredible. They say, John, we're going to need you to leave the retro pack attached. And there's silence for a second. And he says, what is the reason for this? Do you have a reason? And there's silence on their end. And then they say, not at this time. That's what they tell him. He says, what is the reason for this? And they say, we're not telling you. And so he understands that something's going on with the heat shield at this point. And so he, as he described in later years, he braced himself to burn. And he knew that with his back against the heat shield, that as he came through the atmosphere, that the first place that he would feel that searing heat would be his back. And he said that his nerves were playing tricks on him because he kept feeling that it was starting to happen. And in fact, we know that it wasn't. But what did happen was that retro pack began to melt and burn up. And big flaming chunks of it were banging against the side of the capsule. And he didn't know at first whether it was the retro pack that was melting or the heat shield. And so at a certain point, he got through enough of the ionosphere and the heat of it all that he realized that he was going to be okay. But those were certainly the most terrifying moments of his life, just as they were terrifying in mission control. And when he got back to Earth and was finished celebrating, you better believe he had some words with the men who made those decisions not to let him in on what was going on. And he said a few things publicly about how astronauts always need to be in the loop in terms of what's happening so that they can help solve any problems that might be presented. You know, it's a remarkable series of events.
Oh, what a harrowing story! But I'm so glad it turned out well. Did anyone have any other questions?
I will, while we're waiting for your answer, I will just add this. If you spend a lot of time looking for this stuff on YouTube, and I have, as you can tell, there's some news footage from that day that John Kennedy went down to Cape Canaveral. And Glenn is giving him a tour, and they have mounted the capsule on a stand so that Kennedy can take a look at it. And the heat shield is covered with the burn marks that you would expect it to show from coming through the atmosphere. And there's footage of, and I quote from it in the book, but there's nothing like actually seeing the footage of Kennedy kind of leaning into the capsule and looking at it, and Lyndon Johnson essentially elbowing Glenn and saying, tell him the story about what happened on the reentry. And Glenn tells the president what happened and that they thought that it was coming apart, and Kennedy feels around on the heat shield to get a sense of the texture of it. It's a very human moment, the three of them. As Glenn, for one of the first times, tells a story that he would tell for the rest of his life.
You think that the whole controversy about not keeping him in the loop affected later space flights? Like, obviously, famously in the Apollo 13, they were kept in the loop and recruited to help figure it out, for instance.
Yeah, I do think that it had an effect, and a pretty immediate effect. I mean, it was still the case that Chris Kraft and Mercury Control thought that they knew best. And they were also, in fairness to Kraft and the others, they were receiving so much information of so many kinds in terms of, all the sort of telemetered information that was beaming in from the spacecraft about the speed and the position and the what the gyros were doing to orient the craft, and also the biomedical information about the breathing rate and the heart rate of the astronaut, all of this. And they were making decisions on the base of everything that was being fed in. And of course, the astronaut has work to do up there and can't keep track of his own heart rate and what that means and what he, and so it's not that, this should be all in the control of the astronaut or all in the control of mission control. It needs to be a partnership. But there was an imbalance. There was an imbalance of information and there was an imbalance of control. And so I think this was a wake-up call that the astronauts needed to have a greater say, and a greater understanding of what was going on and a greater say in it. And certainly by the time you get to the Apollo program, I mean, Glenn was going around, not to underrate what it was that Glenn accomplished, but he was going around the Earth 3 times. These guys were flying to the moon and back. And they had to play a much greater role in controlling their craft and making decisions along the way, always in coordination, of course, with mission control. But there was a greater and greater set of responsibilities for pilots, for astronauts, when you're flying all the way to the moon, landing the thing, trying to get back up off the Earth, get all the way home. There's a lot to do, and you can't regulate that all from the Earth, and you can't put it all on autopilot. But again, in the early program, this was a consequential moment. What Glenn experienced.
All right, well, and thank you again for finishing that story, Susan. It looks like you had.
Jeff, I don't remember whether you said, and I don't remember from history, was the heat shield actually burning up, or was it a false signal?
Thank you for asking that. I should have made that clear. I didn't actually say. It was a faulty signal. There was a wiring problem with the switch that was supposed to keep track of whether the heat shield was engaged or not engaged. And as soon as they brought this thing back to Earth and they took the components apart, they could see it was just a wiring problem, which ironically is what Chris Kraft thought it was all along. But again, nobody could have been sure. And the stakes of making the wrong call in that moment could be the life of the astronaut. So it was, I mean, some of them were certainly proven right in that moment, but at the same time, those who counseled caution weren't necessarily doing the wrong thing either.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. That was all really fascinating, gripping tale. And thank you everyone too for joining us today to listen to this presentation.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate it.